Today I'm going to show you how I turned this into this. Here is how I did it. The first thing I needed was to find the 3D model. After a quick search on Thingiverse, I came across the Holy Grail. And the best part of all, it was free. Once I downloaded the model, I got straight into printing. If you're interested in the settings I used, they'll be in the description. And a few days later, all the parts printed successfully and turned out looking really nice. After a quick trip to the hardware store to get some screws, I was ready to assemble. To start off with, I had to assemble the front and rear body. Because of the size of my printer, I had to do these in two separate parts. But before I decided to glue anything together, I wanted to test the inner diameter of the front housing to make sure it would actually fit my Glock. As you can see, it fit perfectly. I printed this in ABS, which allowed me to chemically bond the two parts of the body together with acetone. The only part that needed this was the body, so I chemically welded it together with a small square covered in acetone, as well as a bit on the outer edges. After applying a generous amount of acetone to the parts and trying not to leak it over the edges, I added some weight to the top and left it to dry. While I was waiting, I decided to prepare the pistol so I could install the charging handle. I got my 40mm M3 screw and screwed it into the charging handle piece that I'd printed. As you can see, I'm using a hex screw instead of a Phillips head. The only reason I'm doing this is because I couldn't find a Phillips head with the right length at the hardware store, so I have to awkwardly screw it with an adjustable wrench. I wouldn't recommend using hex screws because trying to screw them in with a wrench is a pain in the ass, but it's a workaround, and if you're like me and you couldn't find the right screws, it'll do. So once this was done, it was time to remove the slide from my Glock and swap out the rear sight with the new one I had just 3D printed. All you have to do is remove one screw holding the rear sight in, and it should slide right off. Add in your new rear sight and screw it into the slide. For this part, I had to use a 4-gauge 12mm screw, as the original one would not screw into the plastic that I'd printed. This worked perfectly and didn't affect the functionality of the pistol whatsoever. Now it was time to check back on the front and rear body that I was welding with acetone. Initially it looked pretty good, but I probably needed to use a bit more acetone and something a bit heavier than a HomePod Mini. A few hours later it ended up separating again, but this didn't actually turn out to be as big of a problem that I thought it would be, as the pieces held together pretty well when the pistol was inserted. It was now time to add the rails. I lined up the holes to the body to ensure I was using the correct rail and screwed them all in. I then added the lower handle or magazine holder to the rail and inserted the Glock to test the fit. Perfectamundo! I then screwed it in place using hex screws, but again, I wouldn't recommend using these. If you can find Phillips screws, it will make your life so much easier. But for the sake of the video, it'll have to do. It was now time for the most exciting part, getting this charging handle installed. After a few hand turns, the charging handle was working perfectly. It was now time to install the buffer tube mount. Fortunately, I had Phillips head screws for this part, as hex screws would have been impossible to use due to the nature of the part. I initially had some issues trying to get the part to tighten as the nuts weren't staying put. But after a few failed attempts, I decided to force the nuts into place with a few hits of my screwdriver. Now try to be careful with this, as it's easy to scratch the plastic like I did. If you do scratch it, just use a bit of low grit sandpaper to buff them out. It was now time to install the buffer tube and rear stock. The buffer tube fit pretty well, but it was a little bit loose, allowing for the tube to rotate. I ended up using some blue tack to keep it in place, but you can use super glue if you want it to be a bit more permanent. I then pinched the stock off my M4 and slid it straight on. Very nice. Now if you don't have an M4 stock, then don't worry, because there are a few models out there that you can print. Alternatively, just buy a really cheap M4 and take the stock off that. So this is actually starting to look really awesome now, but it's still missing a few things. Now it's time to put in the spare magazine. It's a bit of a tight fit, but after a few whacks it fits quite nicely. I decided to add on a tactical flashlight I got from Nextorch to the lower rail, and a red dot scope I got off Amazon. Now it is looking epic, but there is still something missing. A barrel! There didn't seem to be any barrel included with the print file, so I went out to find my own. I ended up actually using a silencer that would fit perfectly inside the housing, but it was a little bit too short, so I measured the barrel and added the length to the model. I'll include the download link to this file in the description. It's screwed perfectly into my pistol, but do note I have a 14mm thread adapter on there. But I wasn't really too keen on the red color, as it made it look too much like a toy, so I reprinted it again, but this time in black, to match the rest of the aesthetic. Now there's this extra screw that you can use to secure the pistol to the housing, but I didn't really find it necessary because the rear stock part kind of kept it in place. So I decided to get an M4 50mm screw and use that as a way of holding on a little charm. And in this case, I'm using a little SpongeBob keychain that my girlfriend got for me. I didn't really have a use for it yet, but yeah, now I thought this could be kind of funny because we watch SpongeBob a lot. Now, enough of my blabbering. Let's see this thing in action. So if you were wondering how long it actually takes to assemble this whole thing once you've kind of got most of it put together, it's pretty easy. All you got to do is put in the Glock and then attach the rear stock. All you need to do is tighten these 2 Phillips screws at the back. I've decided to keep this in real time so you can see kind of how long it does take in real life. I could probably do this a lot faster, but taking my time, and as you can see, the next thing I'm doing is adding in the charging handle. So you do need the screwdriver for the stock, but the rest is pretty much by hand. So you can see I'm spinning this in by hand, and then the final piece that you need is the barrel. So I'll be putting that in, and a couple of turns later that'll be nice and snug. It is a bit loose inside, you'll see, but it doesn't seem to affect the accuracy. And there you go. Now, if you have a Glock that has a switch on the side for single or auto mode, you will need to disable it, as the switch will keep getting stuck in the charging handle port. To do this, when you're installing the new rear sight, remove the spring from the sear switch. This will disable the fire select, keeping it in single shot mode permanently, or at least until you reinstall the spring. Make sure you keep the parts in a small plastic bag so you don't lose them. Once you have your slide back on, make sure you keep the switch down to the full auto mode to make sure that that switch doesn't interfere with the slide release port. And make sure you don't over torque the screws, as this can lead to parts breaking or snapping. You can see I went a little bit too far with the rear sight, so I had to reprint it. Here's a comparison to the original model on Thingiverse, and here's the model I made. 3D printing is really fun, especially when you can make parts for your airsoft gun or gel blaster, or change them into completely different guns. Let me know if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to help. Thanks for watching.